December 28th, 2012, from the stylish high-tech underground studios of Ribbit Media in Warwick, Rhode Island, this is NewsUndies. 'For December 28th, 2012, this is NewsUndies, all the news that shouldn't be news. I'm Paul Torville. Well, it turns out the Mayans were wrong, or the people who interpreted the Mayan calendar to mean that the world would end just because the clock rolled over were wrong. In any event, we're still here. Thus begins our final look back at 2012. But first, before we look back at the memorable last stories of 2012, here's Ryan Hanley with one final Jeff Goldblum fact.
You two, you dig up dinosaurs? Chaotician. I'll tell you something, Paul. You know Ryan Hanley. Yeah, he's dead. Yeah, there's only Jeff Goldblum now, who coincidentally was pronounced dead around the same time Michael Jackson passed away. But Ryan, no, he isn't wrongfully dead. No, he's Goldblumily dead. Goldblumily. What just happened? Why am I wearing leather underwear? Back to you.
Thanks, Ryan. Fascinating. And finally, and I do mean finally, one last time for 2012, here are some of the stories that embodied exhalation and dropping shoes. And finally, and I do mean finally, we all saw this coming, didn't we? And finally, and I do mean finally, we all saw this coming, didn't we? Raymond Bellavance Jr. has been convicted of arson in the destruction of the Grandview Coffee Shop in Vassalboro, Maine. Grandview Coffee Shop? Vassalboro, Maine? Our longtime viewers will recall way back in June of 2009, we reported on the topless server controversy and the fire and the arrest in Vassalboro about a week later of Danforth Ross for operating a riding mower under the influence as he and a friend had headed out for more beer. That ought to give you some inkling as to the level of entertainment available in Vassalboro. Bellavance's defense was that everyone was lying. Everyone, including Thomas Mulkern, who admitted he was present when Bellavance poured and lit the gasoline. Since then, coffee shop owner Donald Crabtree has reopened the shop in an office trailer on the same site as the original shop. So, at least they have that. Again. And finally, and I do mean finally, we all saw this coming, didn't we? Eastman Kodak, a company which pioneered and popularized chemical photography beginning in 1889, has filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. In 1975, an Eastman Kodak employee invented digital photography. Of course, at that time, people were still trying to figure out what to use computers for. That! Use computers for that! One of the most common and popular uses for computers today is the creation, storage, management, sharing, and manipulation of digital photographs. From that fateful moment in 1975, Eastman Kodak managed to not embrace the fact that its cash cow, chemical photography, was doomed. Of course, who could blame them? The amount of memory and storage needed to hold one still photograph, let alone moving images, was way beyond what was conveniently available to the consumer in 1975. Who could blame them? Me. I could blame them. Two things proved them to be short-sighted: Moore's Law and lossy compression. Moore's Law says, in a nutshell, that compute power per dollar doubles about every 18 months to 2 years. It was coined around 1970 by Intel founder Gordon Moore.
It's not really a hard and fast law, but it has proven to be mostly right, and Eastman Kodak could have seen that coming. By the mid-90s, when digital cameras were finding their way into the consumer market, who were the prominent players? Strangely, the companies that made cameras, not the companies that made film. Lossy compression, like JPEG, allows in many cases up to a 10-to-1 reduction in file size for a given digital image file. When compute speeds are high enough to make effective use of lossy compression on the fly at the time of image creation, the storage requirements of consumer digital cameras drop precipitously. As flash memory got cheaper and computers got faster still, consumers' use of film for ordinary photography almost stopped completely. By the time Eastman Kodak really tried to embrace digital photography in the consumer space, other players had mature, established offerings, which made Eastman Kodak appear as a new and inexperienced player. Now, here's hoping Eastman Kodak doesn't go down that popular road for those stalwart old technology companies that don't see the end coming, transforming into a patent troll. And finally, and I do mean finally, we all saw this coming, didn't we? First, manufacturing was outsourced to Japan, then to China and Taiwan, and then to India. Then software development moved to India. Tech support went overseas next. Now, gestational surrogacy. If there's one country with a lot of experience making babies, it's India. And now you can take advantage of that experience and the low labor and living costs of this South Asian economy while helping to bring some of the poorest people in the developing world into economic independence. What? Is there something weird about that? And finally, and I do mean finally, we all saw this coming, didn't we? George W. Bush impersonator Steve Bridges has died at the age of 48. Yep. We all saw that coming. He is survived by George W. Bush and Richard B. Dick Cheney. Perhaps the sadder fact. And finally, and I do mean finally, we all saw this coming, didn't we? Encyclopedia Britannica stops printing its iconic leather-bound volumes. The announcement was made by way of a press release on its website, whose URL can be found on Wikipedia or Google. The press release mentions many of the innovations the company has made while being digital, mobile, and social. Well, good for them. And finally, and I do mean finally, we all saw this coming, didn't we? Tom Petty's guitars have been returned. Oh, you didn't hear? 5 guitars went missing from a California recording studio on the 12th. So, he's got them back. Hooray! And finally, and I do mean finally, we all saw this coming, didn't we? British lawmakers, in a 6-4 decision, have found media mega-mogul magnate Rupert Murdoch unfit to run a company. They did not specify that company. They used an indefinite article, from what I understand. A company. Funeral home? No. Amway distributorship? Yeah, right. Dippin' Dots franchisee? Dream on. David Hasselhoff collectibles dealer? Guess again. Tijuana street vendor selling churros made from dough extruded through old car engine parts? No way, Jose. And that's non-binding. And finally, and I do mean finally, we all saw this coming, didn't we? Mike Apatow, a Milford, Connecticut resident, was stopped by state police when radiation detectors in the police car, installed to detect possible terrorist threats, went off. Apatow, a firefighter in nearby Stratford, Connecticut, was returning home following a visit with his cardiologist who had subjected him to a stress test, which involved injecting radioactive dye into Apatow's blood. Of course, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission permits all sorts of products containing radioactive materials which you can, as an unlicensed civilian, own, purchase, and carry. Has post-9/11 paranoia gone way overboard? Yes. And finally, and I do mean finally, we all saw this coming, didn't we? Charlie Sheen has had his fill of the Twitterverse. He's packing up and not coming back. Sheen claims he is no longer getting anything out of the social network. He's probably just too busy winning. Sheen's 7.7 million followers could not be reached for comment because I just don't care. And finally, and I do mean finally, we all saw this coming, didn't we? Republican Speaker of the House John Boehner revealed his alter ego, Captain Obvious, in calling Michelle Bachmann pretty dangerous, following remarks Bachmann made about an aide to Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton. Bachmann had suggested that Clinton aide Huma Abedin had infiltrated the U.S. government on behalf of radical Islamists in the Muslim Brotherhood. When asked whether Bachmann's remarks warranted her removal from the House Intelligence Committee, Representative Boehner indicated he felt the one had nothing to do with the other. The reporter stopped short of asking how an imbecile like Bachmann ever got in the House Intelligence Committee in the first place. And finally, and I do mean finally, we all saw this coming, didn't we? In a turn of events which is making intelligent design advocates cheer with victorious abandon, new antibiotic strains of the sexually transmitted disease gonorrhea, also known as the clap, have arisen, reducing the palette of treatment options available to physicians. Of course, these strains cannot have developed in response to random mutation in fast-reproducing bacteria and selection pressure against strains susceptible to ordinary treatments. No. Indeed, this proves the intelligent design of humans and that the entire universe was made by God as the domain of man. Surely. And finally, and I do mean finally, we all saw this coming, didn't we? After bearing an entire co-ed football team worth of children, including bench warmers, Octomom Nadya Suleman finally has an orgasm. And of all the situations she could have had this experience, on the set of a porno. I needed to know this because why? And now that she's had this empowering experience, what's next for the high-minded paragon of virtue and purity? Earning a living to support her 14 children? I'm guessing it will be more orgasms. And finally, and I do mean finally, we all saw this coming, didn't we? For those of you not subscribing to the Blaze on the internet, Glenn Beck might be one of those names that sort of disappeared under your mind's fridge. Well, Glenn Beck has something to say about GOP presidential hopeful Mitt Romney's recent poor poll performance in the swing states. Incidentally, I think it's a bit disturbing to hear one Mormon man talking about another Mormon man's chances in a swing state. I mean, I thought the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints officially ended polygamy in 1890. Anyway, Beck has come out in an interview with David Barton saying that Romney's poor poll performance now is part of God's plan to make it clear that divine intervention is what gave Romney his victory. You know, when that happens. Then, Beck essentially said that Mitt Romney is George Washington. In a way, that's true. The average American knows just about as much about the real life and attitudes of George Washington as they do about the real life and attitudes of Mitt Romney. And finally, and I do mean finally, we all saw this coming, didn't we? Microsoft has released its new desktop operating system, Microsoft Windows 8. Not since the release of Microsoft Windows Vista in January 2007 have longtime Windows users recoiled in perplexed horror at the release of a new Microsoft product. By most accounts, MS Windows 8 is a disjointed train wreck wherein all the passengers carry virulent and highly communicable diseases. Could Windows 8 be the break Linux desktop enthusiasts have been waiting for? Maybe. But if history teaches us anything, some pair of influential Linux insiders will get in a tiff over some comment in the source code of a driver for some obscure hardware that no one has, and the moment will be lost. 4 years will have passed, and Microsoft will have released a slightly updated version of Windows 7 to replace Windows 8. And finally, and I do mean finally, we all saw this coming, didn't we? Parnassus County Judge William Adams, who has been on suspension with pay for almost a year, after being caught on video repeatedly beating his then 16-year-old daughter with his belt, is back on the bench. This beating was in response to her downloading music illegally from the internet. Sensible. Most analyses report he connected 17 times. Fortunately, Judge Adams' suspension, with pay, is over, and he has been returned to the bench where he can continue to do good for the community. Well, that's all for this edition of NewsUndies. If you see news that shouldn't be news, you can submit your story tips online at newsundies.com. NewsUndies will be back on January 11th with a new format and fresh undies. Thanks for watching. Until next time, I'm Paul Torville, After that, I might be reeling in the years. And perhaps stowing away the time. Gathering up the tears. Have you had enough of mine?